So good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Natalie. I work at the UN Geneva Library and Archives, specifically for the Knowledge and Learning Commons, which we call very familiarly the Commons. And this is our first night class. So welcome to this night class. It's called Mediating in a Multilateral World, Learning to Collaborate Through Conflict Resolution. For those who are new to the Commons, just very briefly, this is our space at UN Geneva for informal learning, for sharing knowledge for diplomats, staff, and interns across the UN Geneva system. And this night class is a pretty special one because it's a collaboration with different entities. And so our guests tonight, our participants, are actually coming from those entities as well. So participants from the International Mediation Institute and the Swiss Chamber of Commercial Mediation. So welcome and thank you to all. We have a diverse group, some connecting from other parts of the world outside Geneva. So thank you for coming here. The idea for tonight's session was actually brought to us by two of tonight's speakers. We have Jeremy Lack from the International Mediation Institute and the Swiss Chamber, as well as Ken Cloke, a well-known international mediator and author based in California. And they wanted to bring this session to UN staff and personnel to look at conflict resolution and mediation and how we can learn through this process. So without further ado, I'm going to present tonight's agenda and also our speakers so we can launch in. Now, just as a reminder, we would like to make sure everyone can hear as well as possible, so please remember to mute your microphone. Thank you. So what are we here for tonight? These are the objectives that our speakers and our team have come up with. We are a diverse group, so we are going to look at gaining an understanding of mediation and conflict resolution, especially in the context of international settings, thinking about it also from the UN multilateral environment, and also the important angle of the link between human emotion and conflict. Also to understand the link between mediation, conflict resolution, and the learning process, so how we can better maybe collaborate and learn as we jointly problem solve. And also for you to come away, hopefully, with some new ideas and insights to take back to your own workplaces and communities. Even if you aren't a mediator, I'm not a mediator, and some of our audience are not mediators either, but how might these ideas play out in your day-to-day interactions at work, especially in a multicultural environment, to support dialogue and hopefully some sustainable change together? So here are our speakers who will be addressing these themes. We have Jeremy Lack, an attorney at law and mediator. He'll be looking at an introduction to conflict resolution and mediation. He'll then pass on to Ken Cloke, our mediator and author, who will be looking more at an in-depth look at conflict resolution, also different approaches and responses to conflict, the role of communication and listening, and also looking hopefully at how we can learn from conflicts and encourage dialogue. We're also very happy to have Dr. Olga Klimecki with us. She is a senior researcher at the Swiss Center for Affective Sciences at the University of Geneva, a psychologist and neuroscientist, and she'll be giving us insights from her own research and work on the role of emotions in conflict and what this means in interpersonal settings and intergroup settings, and hopefully how we can understand conflict and how emotions and how they might play out in how we manage conflicts. We do have about 30 minutes as well for Q&A. We would love to interact with you. We know that that's not very much time, but we'll hopefully get through as many questions as possible. So in order to ask your questions, please use the raise your hand button. You'll find it in the participants icon at the bottom of your screen. So we'll see that you've raised your hand and be able to unmute you to hear your questions. You can also post questions as we go in the chat function, the chat icon. We will also be reviewing those and we'll hopefully be able to get to as many of your questions as possible. I would like to make special note that there are no UN speakers tonight, but we do have UN practitioners in the group, some of who will be able to share some brief interventions on what this all means for the UN context. We have the UN Regional Ombudsman for Geneva, Mr. Nicolas Diatokatos, as well as Enrico Formica, the Senior Mediation Officer at UN Geneva. Also, the Ethics Office from UNHCR is here, also the UN Ethics Office in New York. So thank you all for joining us. And please all enjoy, and I hope that you learn as much as I'm sure I will. This is enough from me. We'll send you the slides slides. There's a lot of content, so don't worry. We're going to send you the slides later. The session is recorded, just as a reminder, and please remember to mute your microphone. That's enough from me. Over to our experts. We're firstly going to start with Jeremy Lack. Thank you very much, Jeremy.
So hello everybody, and it's a real privilege and an honor to be able to address such an august assembly. You know, the United Nations working together with the International Mediation Institute and the Swiss Chamber of Commercial Mediation. I think that's a first. Thank you also, Natalie, and everybody at the UN Library for organizing this unique event, and for obviously Ken and Olga for joining us as speakers tonight. What I was asked to do, given that not everybody is a mediator, is to try and put some background and some context to what this is all about, so that we can then build a certain basic vocabulary so that when Ken and Olga are speaking, people will understand the differences in some of the words. Hopefully just give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. Then we know that it's working. Thank you, Olga. The idea is to really focus on what this is all about. So when we have a conflict, the first thing we need to understand is a dispute is never about what it seems to be about. We tend to see and focus on the objective facts, what is visible to us. And however, what's driving the conflict is more often than not subjective. And in terms of kind of mass and importance, it's what's driving and fueling the entire conflict. And we know from icebergs as a kind of a metaphor, if we were to cut off the top of the iceberg here, it would simply float again like any ice cube would, and a new thing would pop up. So the idea being that if you don't treat a conflict at its source and deal with the subjective aspects of a conflict, it is likely to reoccur. And that's something that's very important as you look at conflict and how to navigate and manage conflict. So when we talk about conflict normally, we understand a spectrum of things. I'll negotiate with you, and if I fail to negotiate with you, because you don't agree with me, then I'll have to litigate, or we might even go to something as drastic as war, because that's the only kind of binary way our logic tends to exist. However, what this slide shows us is that there's a whole range of possibilities. And the interesting thing about this is that there's a range, whether it's structured, evaluative, formal, or informal is one way of looking at it. That's the column on your left. But the spectrum, more interestingly, on the right-hand side, reminds you that when you are on the higher end of this spectrum, you remain in control. Whereas when you move to the bottom, you're abdicating, whether it's to a judge, to a jury, to an arbitrator, or to people with more power who will come in and sort people out, because people sometimes feel they can't talk anymore about the issues at stake. So that is the spectrum. And if we're going to start with negotiation, we need to start off with an understanding of what type of negotiation. Most negotiations that people have are what we call the two monologues. Everybody has their understanding of the situation and they want to convince the other to see things their way. And so basically it looks like two monologues because both sides are arguing, trying to convince one another. The difficulty is getting a genuine dialogue. And the dialogue means an open mind, accepting all information as it is, even if it goes against one's perception, and then with that, rebuilding a new narrative and a new way forward with finding new solutions that doesn't have to discard the other's perception of something, even if it contradicts one's own. And that's a very difficult thing to do. But looking at that spectrum from before, we saw there was arbitration, conciliation, mediation. So these words are important to understand the difference. We're going to start off from the bottom of that spectrum, what is most formal, what is most evaluative in a way, most structured. And we understand this logic. You have party one, you have party two, they have a dispute, and they will go to tribunal, and that tribunal will decide issues, both of process and of outcome. So for some people, that's what the Security Council is about, or that's what the International Court is about. It's this idea that you will find a place to go to apply the rule of law that can look at the top of the iceberg and apply it. So this we understand intuitively. Two children will go to a parent to resolve a conflict because that idea of an authority figure who will resolve issues is kind of natural to human beings. Conciliation in the beginning looks very much like arbitration. You've got your two parties, you've got the person who's now been called the conciliator as opposed to the judge or the arbitrator. And this person is an expert normally who really understands either the applicable international laws or understands the cultures, the norms of that group. And with that, they can create a zone of possible agreement, called in the jargon the ZOPA. And so they can decide what's relevant, what's irrelevant. And these are the people that are often understood to be mediators, because they go out there with their understanding of diplomacy, their understanding of international law, who is right, who is wrong, and they'll be very delicate about it. But what they can do is they can make proposals. They can say, here's the zone of possible outcomes if we apply these legal norms or the norms of international justice. And if you can't agree within this zone that we create for you, we can make you proposals that you are free to accept or not accept, sometimes with a bit of a carrot or a stick attached to these views. This is conciliation, though. For some mediators, it's not the same as an evaluative mediation. This is actually a different form of conflict resolution because it's an objective justice norms-based approach to try and understand what the outcome ought to be, where the result is shaped by norms or international laws. Let's now move on to mediation and what mediation is. Mediation, not for everybody. There's a lot of differences on what mediation means. The idea, though, is that you throw out the norms to some extent. Not all, but the idea is you have the two parties, you have a mediator, but as you can see, this is much more of a facilitated negotiation between the participants. There is no ZOPA. The idea is that you don't bring in the norms to say what should be done. The mediator should not even be making proposals unless everybody's brainstorming and they're simply throwing out and generating ideas. The idea in the mediation is that you can go into that part of the iceberg that is way under the watermark and talk about interests, emotions, conflict, fears. Everything becomes relevant. And you focus on the interests, not the positions. The interests can be at two levels, either substantive in terms of outcome, but even procedural. Why does a person not want to be at the table? Why do they not want to meet the other person? Why do they not want to shake hands? There's always an interest lurking there, and sometimes even more profoundly than interest, even a need. And that need can be something that needs to be understood. But nothing is irrelevant, is the whole idea. You can look at the conflict as a whole, and the norms are no longer what shape the outcome. They are simply there as benchmarks, so that when you've reached an agreement on something, you can go back and say, well, how does this benchmark with what the norms would have applied? Am I better off or not? But it is very different from conciliation, this process, because at the end of the day, we're allowing a concept of pure subjective justice. There are no norms that shape the outcome. Everything is subjective. So that's what we mean when we talk about mediation compared to conciliation, compared to litigation or arbitration or any other kind of top-down imposed system for resolving conflicts. When you're trying to work out how to do this, there's another way of looking at it. It's called the Riskin grid. You can look at the process and say, okay, what type of neutral do we want? Do we want a person who's going to come along and impose and direct us saying, here's how much time I have, here's the documents I want, here's what you need to do in my kind of courtroom, so to speak, to get my process going? Or do you want a person who comes along and says, look, we can do anything. Let's talk about, you can do this, we can do that, you can have written submissions, we can do our mediation online, we don't have to do it together in a hotel room, we don't have to be wearing ties, we can be on a first name basis, or we can keep formalities, do we need interpreters? All of these things can be what facilitates procedurally as opposed to directs procedurally what happens. And then you've got these substantive issues that allow you to choose, do you want a person who has subject matter expertise, or do you have a person who's only gonna have no subject matter expertise? And when you look at it this way, that creates 4 quadrants. But what you are invisibly doing in a way is coming back to this question of which type of process do you want? Because invisibly, you're back to litigation, arbitration, conciliation in this quadrant. You're back to kind of conciliation because it's evaluative and norms-based in this quadrant. And you just have different styles of mediation as long as the neutral is not being evaluative and not trying to get an outcome based on the norms, and that it remains this idea of subjective, interest-driven outcomes. So that's what we will mean in the course of this evening when we're talking about mediation versus conciliation. And it is a very different thing, as you will understand later on, also in terms of brain chemistry and what happens in the room when you're actually handling the case. What happens if the parties don't agree in which quadrant they want to start? That in itself is the basis for mediation in some cases. You'll have people saying, we want somebody who's very evaluative and tell us who's right and who's wrong. We want a top-down authority. And you'll have other people saying, out of the question, we will not recognize anybody's authority over us. What do you do in those situations? You can actually work in combinations. You can have different neutrals working at the same time. So you can combine different quadrants. You can move from one quadrant to the other, agreeing when you'll go. Typically in this logic, you can move easily from A to B to C to D. It's very difficult for a person to start in the D box and work out backwards. But these are all procedural things you can think about when you're trying to do process design to get a mediation involved. Let's now go back to neurosciences, which is going to be a big topic for tonight. We are very excited because in Geneva, at the University of Geneva, we have David Sander and Olga Klimecki, two formidable international scientists who've created a team that is looking at conflict and emotion and the brain to understand how this works. And the logic for tonight's event is that Ken is one of these very rare international mediators who not only understands this, but applies it in his work. Not in the sense of he manipulates people to do things, but there's an understanding in his process that he'll be able to explain, which is how you can bring an understanding of social and group chemistry to work together. Because we have inbred patterns in us, and depending on our oxygen levels and our glucose levels, attention orientation, how we work in teams can be different, which is one of the very interesting things we're discovering about mediation compared to other forms of dispute resolution, which we'll talk about tonight. To give you just a tiny bit of an introduction to what we'll be looking at, I'd like you to have the following kind of analogy in mind. Think of a computer and 3 different operating systems. If you were to try and run Apple and kind of Microsoft at the same time on your computer, it would be very unhappy with you. It could understand that you'll swap back and forth between Apple and Microsoft, but you would never be able to do the 2 at the same time. And bring in Linux software, your system would not work. Our brain is very similar. This is our hardware. It's the brain, and we have evolved with different operating systems. They might be cultural in part, they might be based on our infancy, how we grew up, but we do tend to have at least 3 operating systems that have difficulty working at the same time together and are kind of shuttling back and forth occasionally. We have an emotional operating system. We have a rational cognitive one. They're using that a lot tonight, listening and thinking about what is being said. And we have a social operating system. And to give you a sense of this, we have a model that has to understand also, like the system, is the laptop got power and energy in there? How tired are people? How much oxygen, glucose do they have to be able to metabolize and keep on thinking? But with that, we can look at conflict with what we call the tri-operating system model. And this is important, and I invite you for the discussion later on to think about the impact of process on thinking and the participants in the room during a conflict. So let's look at a conflict. People come into conflict, they have their values, they have their needs, they have their personalities, and hopefully they have a good baseline. Because if they're too tired and they haven't eaten well, it's already very difficult for them to make good decisions. So let's start with the assumption that everybody's got a full battery. What's going to happen is you're going to get a stimulus, and that stimulus is going to trigger behavior. First of all, it's 0 to 300 milliseconds in the brain. It's pre-conscious thinking. It's not even unconscious, it's pre-conscious. You don't have the time to be aware of it. And that's very often where the emotional and the social operating systems start to work. So in the emotional system, you'll start to have an anxiety or stress mode that will be there, or you might feel safe and relaxed is the other extreme, if you look at it in terms of polarities within each of the operating systems. If you look at it in terms of social behavior and the social operating system, you'll either have a sense of inequality, I'm being dominated by somebody, there's an unfairness to the system, or you might have a sense of, on the contrary, these are people I trust, I feel in group, they're members of my tribe, members of my family, we can relax and talk to one another openly. These things get triggered in very quickly in the brain, 0 to 300 milliseconds. It's only at a later stage that we start to use our rational brain. And that's orders of magnitude later in the sense of brain time and brain space. So this is an important thing to understand when we think about process design for conflict. Almost all conflicts that we have, and by the way, when you're thinking rationally, We know that there tend to be patterns of thinking that are there. We can call them out system 1 or system 2 if you're thinking of Kahneman's theories on thinking fast and slow. But to get real dynamic and creative new thinking going, we've got to burn more oxygen and glucose. And if the brain doesn't have that in reserve, it will be stuck in your pre-rigid, preset and rigid thinking, where all your biases will come out and dominate it. So it's very important to understand these ways of thinking. So now let's look at your average conflict. When we normally are in conflict, we are working in this triangular zone. People feel very anxious. Nobody goes to court or to a UN Security Council negotiation that's very delicate with a sense of, I'm going to see friends. There's a tension in the air. There's a worry. There's a fear. What might happen? The sense of out of group is driven by our languages, our clothes, where we sit at the tables, normally in teams. And you have this sense of us versus them that will be prevalent. And when you're looking at it in terms of the cognitive thinking, we are there with the language of rights. Who's right? We're going to prove the facts. We're going to prove the law. We're going to apply this logic that we are right and they are wrong. And so all of this is the usual way in which we go into conflict, which triggers and limits our creative capacities. The idea, if you're applying the tri-operating system model, is that you want to try and activate this zone, the zone of convergence, where people are able to work, first of all, feeling safe in group, that they're motivated by more a sense of reward. What is an interest that we can meet rather than having something imposed on us? And also, what is going to stimulate new thinking, creativity? That means that we're not stuck with our pre-rigid senses of what's going on. So this is one way of looking at the difference between the process as part of the problem and how it can be there. So with all this as a way of for introduction, let me highlight some of the things that are so exciting about Olga's work and the work that's going on. We are beginning to see in the brain things that can be triggered, innate patterns that are distinctively human in all cultures, all races, that are going to be there to reward pro-social engagement, and other mechanisms that exist that are almost genetically conserved about how to deal with what we think to be a threat or an antisocial situation. And Olga's work is showing how this plasticity of the brain and how we can, in certain situations, trigger one mode of behavior, which is a more helpful behavior and reduces aggression, for example, versus other forms of behavior that reduce behavior, increase aggression as the other thing. And with this are all sorts of other corollaries that Olga is measuring. Your capacity to be in compassion or empathy versus disconnected and cold or aloof or separate. And even more interesting, they can even now look at the brain and say, we know which part of the brain is dominant. Dominant maybe is the wrong word, but we know what is being very, burning a lot of oxygen glucose would be my jargon, on what might be affecting thinking. Now the brain is plastic, it's synapses that go everywhere in the brain. It's not just one region operating, but it's how that flow of the energy is directed that is so important. So this was just more by way of an example. You can look at conflicts and how they escalate now in terms of the brain. We know that conflicts tend to escalate from a level 1 where people disagree all the way to a level 9 in the worst cases where people are willing to kill one another because the destruction of the other becomes a goal. But you can understand the importance now of, will you have an evaluative and non-evaluative neutral? Because if you have an evaluative neutral, people might want to create a coalition with that person. They want them to come out and say, you are right, the others are wrong. And that in itself can trigger escalation and fear and that triangular way of thinking rather than going to that source, the core of the Venn diagram we were showing you earlier. So that's one of the dangers of an evaluative neutral. When to caucus, maybe in these cases that people have difficulty being in the room together, there's such anger and hatred that maybe you don't want to put them directly into a joint session. Maybe you want litigation arbitration just to avoid all the emotions, everything else. The really interesting thing about mediation is that it can work on all 3 operating systems. It can work on all 3 systems and get you back into that green zone where you can have a different quality of discussion around it. But then it's very important to understand the role of the neutral from being a conciliator, for example, as opposed to being a mediator. So this is all by way of background and some theory and language. I know it's rushed. It's a lot of information, but it was to set a common background to think about, because really the important thing tonight is to hear from Ken and from Olga. So a few words about Ken. Ken is a very well-known, I'd say, Ken, you won't like the words, it sounds very trite, but a rock star in the international mediation world. And he's a rock star in the sense that Ken is very generous in his thinking, his insights. He's published many books about them. But the interesting thing about Ken is that he doesn't kind of just think about it and write about it, he practices it. Ken has done some remarkable work. I've given some of the countries: Armenia, Australia, Brazil, China, Cuba, Greece, with recent issues both on extreme right and immigration issues. India, Nicaragua, Pakistan, Zimbabwe, Cuba. I mean, you name it. Middle East, Palestinian, Israeli. He's done things. Ken has gone out into the field for people who have not only been having very hot discussions, but have actually been killing one another, or have been so violent that getting them into a room and having real conversation defies understanding at times for how we operate. I tend to do more commercial mediations. I do work cross-culturally. I have seen some dangerous situations, nothing compared to what Ken does. And the fascinating thing about Ken, from being able to speak to him over the years, which I thought would be so interesting to put him and Olga together tonight, is this idea that Ken really does understand the brain. He is constantly reading about it. He's constantly understanding about it. And he has an approach that can take the most strong emotions, anger, hatred, violence, and convert them and challenge them into a different form of communication. And you start off with people in one extreme of thinking, and they come out completely different by the end of the process with Ken. And Ken is going to speak to us a bit about his work, which involves very hot discussions on such issues as race, abortion, immigration, gun control, climate change, but things that are that on a geopolitical scale are very, very dangerous and hot topics. And one of Ken's first books was Mediating Dangerously, because Ken kind of creates this human dynamic with people in the room that is so unique. That's about Ken. Now, to speak about Olga, Olga's research, well, first of all, as a person, she has a unique background in terms of her personal history, her family history. But jumping over that, her interest in science and the brain, she's been looking at all sorts of things. She has a deep understanding of the brain from a neuroscientific perspective, but has developed this center called CISA at the University of Geneva, the Swiss Center for Affective Sciences. And she's doing unique research with people in the field, in the Congo, in Israel, Palestine, looking at unique approaches to what triggers this sort of behavior with an understanding of the brain. And she'll be discussing some of the research they do tonight, which I've been touching on before. And so we're really very privileged and lucky to have both of you tonight with us. I think I'm completely over my time allocation, Natalie, so I apologize for that.
No
and I'm
worries.
now going to hand over to them. But thank you for being with us. And at this stage, I'm going to stop my screen, but ask you, Ken, if you'd take over from there and maybe just talk to us about your approach to mediation, so that Olga can then comment on it and give it to us in the context of her research.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was really wonderful. A very, very useful overview of this topic. But I'd like to begin in a slightly different place tonight. We are having this conversation in the shadow of the coronavirus. And perhaps some of the people who are on this call have actually had the virus. Some of you may have lost loved ones. And if that's the case, our hearts go out to you. And every one of us has had our lives turned upside down by this experience. And so I think it's useful for us to take a moment to just look at what we can learn from this experience, and particularly what we can learn from it about conflict. So in the first place, we can see that every one of us are separated, in the first place, by 2 meters, and in general by geographical distance. The original plan with Natalie was that we were going to do this in person in Geneva, but all of those plans, of course, got changed. But not only are we separated by 2 meters, by our little screens, by households, we are separated by national borders. And every country is handling this very differently. Even in Europe, every country is handling this issue in a somewhat different way. But we also find that the fear around the virus triggers a set of responses that can move in one of two directions. First of all, they can divide us. But secondly, and most interestingly, they are also capable of uniting us. So the virus has actually unified everyone on the planet on a human level, because we're all going through this, no matter where we live, no matter what country. And the virus does not respect national boundaries. It travels way faster in a way than communication. What we have learned in the course of this is that we are incredibly interdependent, that we rely on one another for our healthcare, for our food, even for our water and our gas and our electricity. And the knowledge of that interdependence has an impact on us in terms of how we see ourselves in relationship to each other. This social component that Jeremy has mentioned. We've also been able to see that some of the pollution that we have created in the world has begun to dissipate. Smog around the cities. There are now whales in Wellington Harbor in New Zealand, dolphins and fish in the canals in Venice. And so we can see that there is not only this kind of environmental pollution, there has been a kind of social pollution, a kind of political pollution, a kind of pollution in our relationships that has arisen. So we have the specter now of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, who are at war with one another, with the Houthi rebels in Yemen, reaching a ceasefire because of the virus. The same in Sudan. And in Geneva, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue has produced some breakthrough agreements in Libya over water rights. And so we have this specter of people who are trying to kill each other, all of a sudden stopping because somehow they've discovered that they both are vulnerable to the virus. What is that about? Well, I think that what it is about is a kind of plasticity, that is a word that Jeremy has used, that Olga uses frequently, that's very frequently used in neuroscience, except that it's not just neuroplasticity, which means that the brain is able to modify itself so as to shift its function. If you become blind, the visual cortex begins to convert itself into an organ for hearing. So there's neuroplasticity, but we can also see a social plasticity, a political plasticity. We've discovered that what we thought was solid isn't quite so solid. And this same insight can help us in connection with conflict. So if we think about conflict and particularly not just interpersonal conflict, not just interior conflict, but social and political conflict, we can begin to see that the assumptions that we begin with need to be challenged. And the purpose of this is to kind of look with fresh eyes at some of the conditions that we have assumed are necessary for us to live in. There are three fundamental, I think, evolutionary dynamics that have influenced us. The first of these is competition. The second is collaboration or cooperation. So competition leads to increased conflict. Cooperation or collaboration lead in the direction of resolution. But there's a third force, which is the force of complexity, which combines these in various ways, producing not just a circle, but a spiral. something that moves, that evolves, that adapts, that changes. And out of that complexity comes emergent behavior, new forms of behavior that didn't exist beforehand. So if we ask the question, how do we not just come back from the virus, but how do we come back better? Which I think is a fundamental question for all of us. We want to take a look at how we have handled conflict, and how we turn this dynamic between competition and cooperation and complexity in the direction of a higher order of dispute resolution processes. So about 15 years ago, I started an organization called Mediators Beyond Borders. And we began working in countries around the world with the idea that, just like Médecins Sans Frontières, that conflict has no borders. It crosses borders quite easily. And not only that, but those borders oftentimes get in the way of cross-border cooperation. What is a border? It is a place where communication stops. But as a woman in the United States has very nicely said, a border is just a bridge made vertical, or a bridge is just a border made horizontal. So borders are also bridges. They're ways of connecting with each other through our diversity, and enabling us to engage in potentially a higher level of problem solving. So if we now look at conflict from the point of view of the global community, we can see that there are multiple sources of conflict. In the first place, we can identify conflict as taking place between two or more people, two or more cultures, two or more sides of ourselves. But a ground condition for conflict is that there be two or more, meaning that there be some diversity. So one fundamental condition for conflict is that there be some diversity, some difference between different approaches. We can now think of a definition of conflict as being the presence of two or more truths, two or more sets of experiences, two or more orientations, belief systems. And if we approach those diverse sets of belief systems or values or whatever they may happen to be competitively, as though there was only going to be a single correct truth, we will have created the conditions for conflict. So here's a second definition. Any place where there is a fork in the road, a crossroads that would take you in different directions, and the requirement that you take only one of those directions. Now, the difficulty is there are certain questions that we can ask that have a single correct answer. Let me actually present it slightly differently. With this group of people, I can ask three sets of questions. Question one, who is the oldest person on this call? Who's the youngest? Who's the shortest? Who's the tallest? And now the answer to that question is singular. There is one correct answer for everyone. Second category of questions. How old are you? How tall are you? Where do you live? And now we have a single correct answer for each person. Category three. What does your age mean to you? What issues are you facing at whatever age you are at? what has your height meant to you as you grew up in this world? What do you love about where you live? What do you not love? And now there are multiple correct answers for each person. So there is a way in which the complexity of our response enables us to come to a place where we are able to combine those truths together in some creative way, to search for synergies, for higher order symmetries that emerge out of the conversation that Jeremy has described. Here's a second definition of conflict: the sound made by the cracks in a system. A social system, a political system, an economic system, a family system, a belief system. Conflict is just the sound made by the cracks in that system. Where do those cracks come from? Here's another definition of conflict. Conflict is the voice of a new paradigm waiting to be born. Conflicts arise whenever societies begin to reach the limits of what is possible within the given state of organization that they are at. To put it slightly differently, at any given level of organization, within a company, within a family, within a society, in order to get to a higher state of organization, there has to be an introduction of disorganization. You have to disorganize what was organized at a lower level in order to evolve to a higher level. And so having an evolutionary attitude toward conflict ends up being really critical and essential. If we take a look backwards at the conflicts that we have had in our lives, going back to our lives as children, we can see that most of those conflicts are now beneath us. We don't get into them anymore, not only as individual conflicts, but as categories of conflict. We're not attracted to them. We're not drawn into them. They don't have any meaning for us anymore. And the reason is because we have transitioned to a higher order of resolution processes. We have learned a set of skills that allow us quite easily to grapple with those conflicts. And I'd like to give you an illustration. And for this, I'd like to go to a set of slides. But before I do that, I'd like to introduce the idea. In mathematics and physics, there is the idea of a dimension. And dimensionality in mathematics and physics can be defined in two ways. First of all, by how many pieces of information you require in order to know where something is located, or in order to define something. But secondly, and more interestingly, we can think of dimensions as a degree of freedom. So I'm going to share this particular slide now. And what it shows is the dimensions of conflict resolution using dimensionality as a metaphor. So at 0 dimensions, there is no room for movement. And what you get is impasse, chaos, anarchy. 1 dimension, all you need to know in order to know, where something is located is one person's opinion. This means you go to the boss, to the dictator. 1 dimensionality is inherently power-based because there is only one input. No matter how many people are involved, you only need to know what one of those people thinks in order to be able to have an understanding of where something is located or what's going to happen. So this has to do with my solution, but it's often factually informed, and what you get as a result is obedience. In 2 dimensions, we move from a line to a plane. And now there are 2 dimensions. There's an x-axis and a y-axis. There are 2 opinions. two ways forward, two ideas about what to do in response to a problem. But what happens because there are two is that competition arises between the two, so it becomes adversarial. And one of the principal mechanisms that is available to you to resolve adversarial conflicts mentioned by Jeremy is essentially compromise. And this is what happens in conciliation. It sometimes happens in what we call bargaining in the shadow of the law. So it's legally informed, and what you have to do at the end of it is you have to accept it. In 3 dimensions, we now have depth in addition to height and width. And what depth corresponds to is the introduction of interests. And the introduction of interests gives us a new degree of freedom. It now is not just one person's idea, or even a compromise between two, but a unique way of combining those two together in order to create a third. In other words, synergies become possible, syntheses become possible, collaboration is encouraged. This is emotionally informed as opposed to legally or factually informed, and what you get at the end of it is consensus. But we can also imagine a 4th dimension. And I hope you enjoy looking at the hypercube or tesseract at the bottom. It took me an hour to draw this, so I hope you really appreciate this. And what we can now think of, particularly in connection with families, in connection even globally with what we are experiencing through this virus, is a more heart-based connection that is grounded in caring, is more relationally informed, and what results from this often is unanimity. Now, how do you get from 0 dimensions to 1 dimension, or 1 to 2, or 2 to 3? And the answer is, in order to get from 1 dimension to 2 dimensions, you take a line and you drag it 90 degrees in a brand new direction. And to get from a plane, you take a plane and drag it 90 degrees in a brand new direction, a direction that did not exist before you imagined it. Another way of thinking of it is you take a plane and you lay down an infinite number of planes, and you will produce a cube. But the point of the cube is that you are now able to move at a 90-degree angle to the way that you were able to move before, a brand new direction that didn't exist. So any problem that exists on a 2-dimensional plane that is difficult to solve can be solved easily by moving into a 3rd dimension. So if you're on a line and you want to jump ahead of the line, you can't do that. But in 2 dimensions, it's easy. And on 2 dimensions, if you want to reach into the interior of a circle, it's impossible on a plane. But in a cube, it's easy. So, but what it looks like is magic. And so mediation begins to look like magic for this reason. It is magical because it draws people in the direction of what is important to them. To put it slightly differently, power and rights are both zero-sum games. There is a winner and a loser. When you go to court, there's a winner and a loser. If you vote all in favor, there are winners and losers. And if we combine voting with inequality and discrimination, you're going to get stereotyping and bias directed at people who are in the outgroup. But the point about interests is nobody has to lose. That doesn't mean that every issue can be resolved in a way that is favorable to everybody on every level, but it means that it's not necessary that anybody lose in order that somebody else get what they want. The easiest example of this is we're in a room, there's an air conditioning unit, some group of people wants it turned off, the other group wants it turned on. If you resolve that issue on the basis of power, one side wins and the other side loses. and it doesn't feel good to lose. If we resolve it on the basis of rights, you send it to a judge or you vote on it, once again, somebody loses. But the real truth of this is nobody has to be cold in order for somebody else not to be stuffy. The air conditioning unit isn't the only way of solving this problem. Going back to Fisher and Urey, we can say that we want to expand the pie. We can introduce other options. So this is just a metaphor for how to think about, for how to think about conflict resolution using a dimensional analogy. The question then becomes, what exactly do we do in order to move, in order to create a higher degree of freedom? And the answer is, we ask a question that doesn't have a single correct answer. Like, how does that feel to you? Why is that important to you? Why do you feel so deeply and passionately about this issue? What does this issue mean for you? So I don't have a lot of time to go through all of the various slides that are here. It will take us way too long. And what I would like to do instead is to jump ahead to the question of, how do we talk about the issues that we feel strongly about? And this is in relationships, in our families, with our spouses, our children, our parents. It's with our neighbors. It is in societies and between cultures over difficult political and social issues. So the last book that I wrote is about, the title is Politics, Dialogue, and the Evolution of Democracy, meaning how do we create an interest-based form of political conversation and decision-making. And here what I would like to do is to give you some very specific things that you can do the next time you are asked to talk about a hot political topic. So here are a couple of slides that will hopefully help you do that. How to talk about hot topics. First, by creating an atmosphere, an attitude, and a context of unconditional respect for each other, regardless of our opinions or positions on the issues. This is easily said, but not so easily done. On the other hand, here's one way of doing it. I designed a dialogue in Puerto Rico for spokespeople for statehood and spokespeople for independence, which are the two hot issues in Puerto Rico. And the number one rule for the conversation, we designed a whole set of questions to ask people, but the number one ground rule for the conversation is, you can say anything that you want, but you cannot use the words statehood or independence in this conversation. Right now, I'm working with a group of people who are trying to change politics in the United States, and there are growing divisions between supporters of Bernie Sanders and supporters of Joe Biden, supporters of Elizabeth Warren, et cetera, in the United States. And all you have to do in any conversation is to say the word Bernie Sanders or the word Joe Biden, and all dialogue stops. Everybody knows what everybody else thinks. All the questions have already been answered. There's no point in talking any further. So in order to create an atmosphere of respect for each other, we have to ask questions that cannot be answered with the word Bernie or Joe. Number two, be sure to include people who do not agree with each other. Don't play it safe. Don't only invite people into the conversation who agree. Several years ago, I worked with a group of Greek mediators to design dialogues and conduct them between Greek citizens and immigrants. And these, as you all know, are very hot issues in Greece. And those were very powerful conversations. Here were two of the, but what we had to do was to bring together people who did not agree with each other. What we did as a part of the opening was to ask each person to answer for themselves the following two questions. Question one, in your life, in a family or neighborhood or school or workplace, have you ever been the new one and everybody else has been there for a while? What did that feel like? How were you treated? What are some stories that you could tell about what that was like for you? And question two, have you ever in your life, in a family or neighborhood or school or workplace, been the one who's been there for a while, and now these new people are coming in and changing everything? What did that feel like? How were you treated? What did people say to you? What experiences did you have? So we began to explore what it might feel like to be an immigrant or a Greek citizen. And in two questions, everybody can start to get in touch with that. And now we can start to talk. We need to reach consensus sometimes on a set of ground rules or shared values that are going to guide the conversation, like respectful listening, using skilled facilitators to keep conversations on track, or mediators to intervene if they're necessary. And what we're talking about here, what I'm specifically doing, is organizing dialogues in the United States in various places over issues that are hot political topics: abortion and right to life, issues of racism and sexism. Just next week, I'm going to be working with an organization that's falling apart because people have accused each other of these things and they don't know how to talk about them in ways other than accusing each other of doing terrible and nefarious things. So they will need someone to facilitate that conversation. In other words, someone who is outside the conflict to give them a perspective on what it looks like from the outside. By agreeing not to suppress anyone's experiences, reflections, ideas, beliefs, passions, or emotions, and by focusing on the problem as an it rather than as a you, not personalizing it. And we can take any statement of any problem and turn it into a kind of objective statement, which moves us into that area in Jeremy's slides where we're able to look at things using the logical, sequential centers of our brains, and putting our prefrontal cortex to work by asking questions that don't have a single correct answer, by consistently coming from a place of curiosity and learning and probing to discover the deeper meaning of the issues to each person, acknowledging and validating everyone's deepest interests and concerns, intentions, and experiences. This takes practice. And what it requires us to do is to acknowledge that the issues that we are talking about are not the deepest issues. The deepest issues are not generally, for example, between gun control and the right to bear arms. They are what those issues mean to people, how they translate into identity, what they mean freedom, or they mean death. So let's talk about freedom and about death. Let's talk about how this plays out in terms of identity, in terms of social connection, by expressing gratitude and thanking people for their dissent and their diversity, their courage, and their willingness to learn, breaking large groups up into smaller groups where everybody can participate. You have all probably been in large group sessions where people were screaming and yelling at somebody up in the front of the room. Those are pointless. So take that meeting and break it down into a set of small groups where nobody screams and yells at each other anymore, because it's just not polite. It's not the right way of doing things. You connect with other people at a small scale that you don't do at a large scale. Share responsibility for group process. Ask them to appoint facilitators, recorders, presenters, process observers, even mediators, timekeepers. Divide up tasks and let people take responsibility for the operation of their group. We do it by modeling openness and honesty, empathy and compassion, listening and acknowledgement. The second one is the one that the 12th item is the one that I mentioned before. Number 13, by stopping the process when it isn't working. Just stop it. Talk openly about what isn't working and agree on what can be done to improve it. So here's something: everybody in this call has been in a meeting that was pointless, that was a total waste of time, that was actually completely counterproductive and frustrating. And everybody in this room has sat through a meeting like that in silence. So the next time you're in a meeting like that, just raise your hand and say this: excuse me, is this meeting working for everyone? Because it's not working for me. Can we go around the room right now and ask everybody to say one thing that would make this meeting work better? You just threw a bomb into that meeting. You stopped it in its tracks. And we can stop conversations in their tracks that are not working. And the moment we do that, the entrainment into the negative conversation, the feeling that we have to move in that direction stops. Just like the feeling during the coronavirus, that somehow everything is going to go on as it always has, and all of a sudden it doesn't. Number 14, by designing questions that will draw people on opposite sides into dialogue and conversation with each other. My favorite definition of dialogue is given by David Bohm, a really first-class physicist during the 20th century. He wrote a number of different books on physics and was very deeply involved in efforts to reconcile general relativity and quantum mechanics. But later in his life, he went into dialogue, and he defined dialogue as the stream of meaning that flows between us. How it is that we discover meaning from each other. Now, this is a really interesting and profound question. How we get that meaning by watching each other, by listening to each other, through a whole series of different mechanisms. Number 15, by asking people in small groups to brainstorm possible solutions and present them to each other. Brainstorming is a very powerful and a useful thing. And everybody on this call, for example, right now, if we broke into small groups, would be able to come up with a variety of different ideas about how we could handle conflict going forward on a global basis. Reaching consensus on recommendations for action, looking for things that could be implemented and things that require further discussion, looking for ways for the people on opposite sides to agree on practical steps for improving their communication and relationships. What is one thing I could do that could improve our relationship going forward? What is one thing I could do that could improve our communication? Try asking that. And applauding people's efforts, acknowledging their contributions, and then eliciting feedback, jointly evaluating it, and making improvements. So this is a kind of overview of some of the things that can be done. There are lots more slides that you can take a look at, but there's something else that I wanted to say at the end of this. And that is basically this. The coronavirus has taught us that there are global problems that require global solutions. So just as if you have a three-dimensional problem and you try to solve it using two-dimensional mechanisms, you're going to get stuck. In a similar way, if you have a global problem and you try to solve it within national borders only, it's not going to work. So what we are being reminded of is this is just one of a set of problems that we are now facing as a species that are global in nature and require global cooperation. What gets in the way of global cooperation? What do we have to do in order to be able to achieve it? It's all this stuff we're talking about. What gets in the way of it is conflict, is the belief that there is only a single correct way forward, that we cannot figure out some way of combining our various beliefs about what needs to happen and achieving some higher order solution. But isn't this what every couple does all the time? Isn't this what families do? Isn't this what people in neighborhoods have done? Isn't this what people in Europe as a whole facing this coronavirus have done? And we can tap into this incredible brilliance and creativity of human beings on condition that we develop the skills to bring them into communication with each other and turn them and their intense fears and anxieties and feelings of grief and loss and rage in the direction of solving the problem that we have now framed as an it rather than as a you. So here is kind of the final piece of this. These global problems are not disappearing. They're becoming more intense. The demand for us to respond to those global problems with a higher order of resolution processes, a higher order of understanding, is only growing and can only get greater. So what we have to do is to figure out how to talk to each other around the world, how to solve our problems together. And in order to do that, we require communication skills, dialogue skills, facilitation skills, consensus building skills, collaborative negotiation skills, nonviolent communication skills, restorative justice skills, mediation skills. All of these form a part of what I think of as the collaborative arts and sciences. And in order to do those, we require a deep understanding of the brain, of neurophysiology and how it operates across cultures, and not just of neuroplasticity, but of social and political plasticity as well, because it is only out of that systemic redesign process, I believe, that we are going to be able to get to a place where the conflicts that we experience cease being sources of misery and become sources of opportunity and higher orders of resolution. Thank you very much. Thank you. Natalie, back to you.
Right on time. Thank you very much, Ken. That was very, very fascinating. Thank you. Thank you for sharing all of this. And Ken's slides, don't worry, we will share them as a package in a PDF tomorrow once the session is done, because I know a lot of people were very interested in your slides, and thank you for sharing them with us. Now, over to you. Pardon me, Ken.
One piece to just add that I forgot to mention before. The slides belong to you. Use them. You do not have to ask for permission. Take them and use them in whatever setting you would like.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Now over to Olga. Dr. Klimecki, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. Thank you, Jeremy. Before sharing my slides, I would try to integrate what you said and add my thoughts to it from a neuroscientific perspective. So Jeremy was talking about the 3 different systems, so emotions, social relations, and the rational system. And Ken was talking about the different dimensions we bring in and the caring approach and the safety. And to me, they all come together in a model of the brain. So if we think about our brain as kind of my hand, and you have the spinal cord that's here in our neck, you have it here, and you have the old parts of the brain, like the limbic system in here, and you have the cortex around here. So if the brain is working as it should in a normal way, all of this is integrated and the information flows upwards and downwards. And so if we then see, for instance, a snake, and we get the information from our body, snake, snake, the cortex can calm our system down and tell us, it's a snake, but it's not a dangerous snake. Don't worry. Yeah? So this is what happens when all the system is integrated. When we are stressed, be it individually or collectively, or even worse, when we are traumatized, this connection between the frontal cortex mainly and the limbic system, this regulation breaks down. So this happens whenever we are stressed in everyday way, so in conflicts especially, or if we are traumatized after really tough events. And these tough events can also, they don't have to necessarily be major wars, but also in relationships we can have traumatizing events, or in social settings, things and events can be traumatizing. And I think what Ken is doing so beautifully in his 4-dimensional model, he is bringing, through his questions and through his presence, he is bringing a kind of safety bag that allows the stress system to integrate again, and the emotional part and the rational part and the social part to become reconnected. And I think this is the beauty of his approach. And it shows the plasticity, because we can move from one state where we're disconnected and running around as if we were headless and directionless, to a very integrated state where rational thoughts can help us to calm emotions and to socially reconnect. Okay, I will try to share my slides. Wait a second. How? Share screen. And why did it show Windows? Windows open. Okay, this is okay. So in a way, what I've been trying to do in my work is to look at the plasticity of the social brain and to see how we can get this sense of connection, this sense of caring, how we can foster this in order to move from conflict and stress to cooperation, collaboration. There are 3 basic principles or key assumptions that I would like to share that are underlying my work. And these are, first of all, that emotions play an important role in conflicts. We would not be in any kind of conflict if we would not care about an issue. We know also from decades of psychological research that emotions motivate behavior, and that very specific emotions are associated with very specific tendencies for behavior. So even if we can't act out a certain behavior, we will have a certain tendency or wish to act in a certain way. And thirdly, we know that we can change emotions. We can change them on a level of the lifespan, but we can also change them in a particular situation. We can change emotions in adults, and we can change the brain functions that underlie emotion. And this is very exciting to me, because through this change, I believe we can move to the cooperative part. Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economy in 2002, said that high-stake problems are likely to involve powerful emotions and strong impulses to action. And I think every one of you who's been in a conflict, and probably all of us have been there, we know that it feels very emotional. And once these emotions, this grip of emotion ceases, we can outgrow the conflict, and we are no longer involved in that competitive way anymore. We also know from research that's relatively young, so from research that has been going on for the last couple of years, especially in Eran Halperin's group in Israel, that there are different types of emotions that are associated with different types of behavior in international conflict. So we know, for instance, on the constructive emotion side, that feelings of hope, but also feelings of guilt, so admitting there is something wrong I did there, and potentially feelings of compassion are constructive emotions in that they influence peace building in a beneficial way. On the other hand, there are destructive emotions, which are hatred, fear, and schadenfreude or malicious joy. I think for fear it's rather obvious. Malicious joy is when you rejoice in the misfortunes of others. Hatred is very interesting to me because we see here in the middle, there are two emotions, anger and empathy, that can go both ways. So usually empathy tends to be rather good and associated to conflict resolution, but not always, and only in certain conditions, and I will be talking about those. The difference between anger and hatred is really interesting to me because researchers have seen that feeling angry is not necessarily a bad thing. It can be associated to more support for violent behaviors or even more support for wars, but it can also be associated to more risk-taking in order to restore a relationship that has been damaged through conflict. And what is underlying this kind of shifting role of anger is that it is directed at the behaviors of someone. When I'm angry at someone, I think that someone misbehaved in a certain way, but I don't think that the person is inherently bad and is intentionally trying to harm me or my group, which is the case for hatred. So the problem with hatred is people assume that the other is really bad inherently. It can be the other group or the other person, and that the other will want to harm us or myself, and that the other will never change. So if we want to move out of hatred, one way of doing that is try to move towards anger first before moving to other more constructive emotions. So first trying to deconstruct this notion of this other person or group is inherently bad and will never change. Okay. Different routes to understanding others. I'm working a lot on understanding others through empathy or perspective taking, so I would like to tell you a bit more about the definitions that are behind it. So empathy for me is sharing others' emotions. So if someone else is happy, I can share this happiness, knowing that my current feeling of happiness comes from another person's happiness. When we move to suffering, empathy can have two different sides. One is empathic distress, where people can become overwhelmed by other people's suffering. And this, I think, currently, I see a risk for that, especially for all the doctors and nurses working with corona patients. The suffering that they see every day can become really overwhelming, and this could be a source of empathic distress. On the other hand, one can also deal with the suffering of others or the stress of others with a rather compassionate feeling. So this is more a feeling of concern for others, associated with the motivation to help, and it's more connotated with kind of positive emotions for the other. So this is the emotional part. On the cognitive part, we have perspective taking, which is a cognitive understanding of the other's thoughts or intentions. And we can also use that in order to move forward in a conflict resolution. But perspective taking is also a double-sided sword, and that we can also use it to understand our adversaries better in order to harm them in a better way, right? So not always positive. What Jeremy has already alluded to is, in my research, we have found that there are different brain activations underlying rather the feeling of distress, like when this integration doesn't happen very well, it's associated with negative emotions, associated with activations in the anterior insula, which is around here, and the anterior cingulate cortex, which is very much in the center of the brain, two regions that are active when we suffer ourselves. And if we get engaged in this kind of empathic distress, for instance, over several days, we can increase activations in these areas. And this is not adaptive when it comes to social behavior. On the other hand, we can also train, and this were trainings in meditation that I did, not mediation, but meditation. We can also train ourselves to reinforce positive emotions, reinforce the notion of safety for ourselves, and reinforce our willingness to help others, as well as activations in brain centers important for positive emotions, but also, especially the orbitofrontal cortex shown here, centers important for integrating rational or thoughts and emotions. So in the orbitofrontal cortex, our emotions can be used as information in order to guide choices, like which apple do we buy? but also which profession do we take? Which decision will we take in this conflict, etc. So this is very important to make this part of the brain work in a very good way. So, good. I'm moving now into more behavioral paradigms. So this is not fun. So we know that empathy is associated with more altruism. So there is work dating back to the 70s and meta-analysis already from the 80s in psychology showing over and over again that overall empathy is associated with more altruistic actions, with less aggression, and with less punishment, which is good. There are limits, but more or less, that's the rule of thumb. We also know that empathic distress is usually associated with withdrawal, or we help in order to alleviate our own suffering. However, we have good evidence that feelings of compassion are very stably associated to altruism, to reduced punishment, and even to more forgiveness in post-conflict settings like Northern Ireland, and to a reduction in implicit biases towards outgroups like racial outgroups. So to me, compassion, or this caring system, is very promising when it comes to resolving conflicts. And I think it kind of works with this fourth dimension that Kenneth has been shown. Perspective taking, as I said, is generally associated with more altruism and less punishment, but not always. In certain situations, it can also be used against other people, especially when people feel threatened. They would tend to use perspective taking in order to harm the other. Okay. We have done some work looking at how we can increase altruism, for instance, through inducing empathy. And we found that showing people who are suffering in short video clips, for instance, can increase pro-social behavior in monetary interactions. And it does so even in violent offenders. So we really went to prisons and tested people who had killed several people and who were sentenced for life. And even these empathy inductions did something in their behavior, which was quite promising to us. We also have tested how a kind of conflictual setting between different players in an economic game is influenced by traits of compassion and perspective taking. And we saw that people who in their everyday life feel more compassion and engage in more perspective taking, they show less punishment behavior. And also people who have stronger activations in a part of their brain, that's the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex around here, that's important for regulating emotions. These people also show reduced punishment behavior. People who feel more distress in their everyday lives actually show more punishment behavior and more aggression. What is important when it comes to empathy is that target characteristics play a role. So ideally, we would want to personalize another group or the targets, because we know that a single individual receives more help than multiple individuals in need. So there are several studies on that, not from my group, but from other groups. And so if we have multiple individuals, for instance, in a group or in a country, it's good to either try and personalize them through individual stories, or to say this is a family or a group, and also give this group a kind of personalized flavor. We also know, and this is a similar thing, so the identifiable victim effect is about helping. Compassion fade is about the feeling of compassion. And we know that compassion fades the more people we are faced with. So also here, if there are multiple targets, either try to pick out one and tell a rather concrete story, or the idea would be form a group of them, saying, okay, these are members of one community, and this is how their everyday life looks like, to increase compassionate feelings for multiple individuals. We also know that there is a bias to feel more empathy for members of one's own group, and less empathy and actually more malicious joy to members of other groups. And the idea that we have is that through training compassion, through training to relate to the others in a caring way, we can start to overcome this bias. And overcoming this bias is important for inducing collaborative behaviors. Okay. A bit more about the role of motivation and subject characteristics, because more and more we find out that probably when it comes to interventions, there's not one size fits all, a one size fits all solution, but it may have to be targeted, because the motivation of people to engage in certain strategies or techniques may differ. So what we did in this experiment, we had people in Geneva who were either pro-immigration or anti-immigration come to the lab and discuss issues around immigration. So they did not know that they were selected that way, that they were selected pro and anti-immigration, and that they had then to discuss these issues that we knew that it would probably induce a conflict in them. And they had to do it in one of three conditions. In one condition, they actually were asked to feel empathy for the other. In another condition, we asked them to take the perspective of the other. And in the third condition, they had no particular instruction when working on 10 issues around immigration. What we found that only the pro-immigration participants were actually motivated to engage in the empathy and perspective instructions, and the anti-immigration participants were not motivated to do so. In the anti-immigration participants, actually, the perspective-taking instructions aggravated the perception of the conflict. So it would be important for me, my lesson was that in the future, I really have to make sure that people are motivated in the first place to engage in a certain intervention before I propose it to all kinds of people, right? And the motivation to feel in a certain way can stem from different sources. One is the hedonic desire to feel good, but one is also to feel an emotion that would serve me to attain a certain goal. So we know from research that people who are about to be in a competitive negotiation are motivated to feel anger because they intuitively know or think that it will help them to gain the difficult negotiation, right? So we know that the motivation for empathy differs for people of different political orientations, and that people who are at the right side of the political orientation spectrum tend to have very low motivations to feel empathy for others and to engage in pro-social behavior. So maybe we need to work more with indirect regulation strategies. Two other things that have been shown to play a role in research of people in Israel, so this is Natalie and Mediating, are the phase of conflict and the trust. So in their research, they have shown that in the high phase of conflict, an induction of empathy, so Israeli participants read a speech expressing empathy from a Palestinian leader. So in this phase of high conflict, this empathy induction actually reduced the willingness for reconciliation for these Israelis who were low in trust, right? So they saw that two things matter, the level of trust and the phase of conflict. So two more things to keep in mind for me when thinking about designing interventions. We have done some work on interventions in order to promote conflict resolution or pro-social behavior. So some of that work was done with Cora Aguirre and Emna Eme, together with them and the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs and the Red Cross Association and Red Cross Association. We did a study in 4 countries, Armenia, Belarus, Gambia, and Russia, in which we trained teenagers and young adults in humanitarian values for 5 days at schools or local groups. And we saw that it increased the willingness to help outgroup members for those participants who had an increase in compassionate feelings towards these outgroup members as a result of this 5-day training compared to a group that did not receive the training. We also did a study where a doctoral student of mine, Patricia, actually did a 5-week compassion training compared, so participants were randomly allocated to either 5 weeks of compassion training, reappraisal training, so trying to change one's emotions in a beneficial way, or Italian training. And we saw that compassion training was the most beneficial, and that compassion training increased our feelings of closeness, our participants' feelings of closeness, and reduced feelings of schadenfreude or malicious joy towards a disliked other person. So this was an interpersonal conflict, not an intergroup conflict, interpersonal conflict. We're currently running this study in the Israelo-Palestinian context, but we don't have the results. We also saw that if we don't have 5 weeks or 5 days, just thinking about the future for 1 minute can increase pro-social behavior. So here participants either had the instruction to think about the future for a minute or to name animals. And the people in the future thinking group showed much more pro-social behavior, which was quite amazing to us. So it's a very effective instruction if it works after this one. We also tested, so this was work of François Bogac and Halima Rafi, we tested the impact of mediation on couple conflict. So we used couple conflict because it's a relatively easy way of getting a real world conflict into the laboratory. And we had couples discuss all sorts of things, and I was quite touched. So they discussed things from their relation to the other couple members' parents, to issues around their children, also to issues around sex, etc. So it was very touching. And actually, some of the couples got into severe conflict, so we had to stop one couple in their fight because they were about to break up in our lab. What we saw, however, is that we had an improved conflict resolution in those couples who were mediated compared to couples who are not mediated in the conflict. And there are some mediators on the call who actually worked with us in these studies. So thank you for helping out. So mediation seems to improve conflict resolution, at least in romantic couples. We also did a study where we measured participants' brain activities before the couple conflict and after the couple conflict. And what we saw in that study is not only that mediation had an improved conflict resolution for these couples who were mediated, but also that the mediated group had a higher activation after the conflict when they saw the picture of their romantic partner in a brain region that's called nucleus accumbens, and that's in green on the slide. And this brain region is really important in everything that processes reward and positive emotions. So even though that through the conflict in general, their activation related to romantic love, it decreased in both groups. In the mediated group, it remained relatively higher, and especially in the nucleus accumbens, which for us gives a lot of hope that mediation also affects the neural way we see a romantic partner, even though we were in a conflict before. We've also looked at things that may be harmful for conflict. So the first study I will present is Patricia Sanada's study on sleep deprivation. So we invited couples to the lab, again, because it's an easy way of having a real conflict in the lab. And half of the couples were not allowed to sleep, and the other half were allowed to sleep. And we saw that those couples who did not sleep had an increased level of cortisol. So cortisol is a hormone responsible for triggered when we are stressed. And they had an increased level of cortisol when they were in a conflict discussion. So talking about this image here, it's when we basically flip the lid open, and when this connection between the frontal cortex and this regulatory effect on our limbic system, the soothing effect disappears. So this is what actually happens with a lot of cortisol being active. We also know that stress and cortisol levels are increased, or we actually increased them, and that increased stress is associated with more punishment behavior. We did this study in men, so it was in healthy. Okay, summary time. We know that overall empathy and compassion are associated to better interpersonal, but also to better intergroup relations. And we know that there are interventions that can increase these kind of emotions. So we can do it through instructions, just asking people to empathize. We can do it through films that elicit empathy, or we can do it through trainings, like meditation trainings. Other interventions that are beneficial are mediation, training humanitarian values, or thinking about the future. I think more and more research shows that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and that it's important to pay attention to target characteristics. So we have single, multiple targets. Is the target in-group, out-group? What's the motivation of people? Are they, taking, for instance, their political opinion, or the phase of conflict, or the level of trust they feel? is it likely that a certain intervention is going to work? Will they be motivated to feel empathy? Will they be motivated to feel compassion? Or is there an extra step we have to take? And we know that there are adverse effects of stress and sleep deprivation on conflicts. I thank my wonderful team, some of whom you see here on the photo during a dinner party. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Olga. That was incredibly interesting. And for anyone who's interested to get the slides, don't worry, we'll also send them after the session. So you're right on time. We have about 25 minutes left for some interaction together. Good work. Before we get to any questions you might have, I firstly wanted to ask Nicolas Theatokratos. He's our regional ombudsman at UN Geneva. If he would have any remarks from the UN side. Nicolas, thank you for joining. I'm just going to unmute you now.
Great. Thank you so much, Natalie. This has been a really special evening for me because one of the things that I've been thinking about is vectors of transmission, not necessarily because of disease, but because of ideas. And so, Jeremy, I don't know if you remember, but you once received a panic call from me in Asia just before I did my first mediation around 15 years ago. And Ken, you spoke to our group about narrative mediation. And so many of these ideas that I heard today really have resonated with me. And I think, Ken, that one talk that you gave to us maybe in 2012, 2013, sort of planted a seed that is now coming to fruition. And as you were talking about the progression from the third dimension to the fourth dimension, I believe that our office is trying to make that leap from dealing with, pure needs and interests to something that is more relational based. And, we're working on how concepts of dignity and civility can help the organization have much more robust exchange of ideas without making the participants feel bruised. So I think this has been a really fascinating convergence of a lot of ideas that have come together. I think I don't want to take too much time, but maybe I can place our office in the context of conflict resolution generally, because we consider ourselves to be an office of conflict resolution, but the term ombudsman sometimes throws people off because that's viewed as a much more directive office. And so what I wanted to share with you is perhaps 2 or 3 minutes about the mythology of how the organizational ombudsman came to be, and then explain a little bit of my practice. So Natalie, if we have 2 or 3 minutes, would that be okay?
That's great, thank you.
So, for many of you who are familiar with the term, ombudsman is a Swedish term, and it really originated when King Charles of Sweden in probably around 1703 was exiled from Stockholm, and he ended up in Constantinople. And while he was there, he saw this agent of the Sultan going around the souk, making sure that the services of the Sultan were adequately given to the citizens. And so he took that idea back with him to Stockholm and created this notion of the royal ombudsman. And so that started the classical tradition of an ombudsman who, by law had wide powers of investigation, and oftentimes their decisions had to be followed by law. Now that doesn't sound very conflict resolution-ish, right? That sounds like more of a judicial process. And so what ended up happening in the 1960s in North America, while there was this period of social upheaval, a lot of corporations and academic institutions adopted the term ombudsman because it had this connotation of fairness. But the organizational ombudsman that developed in that context was really a conflict resolution office. And when the UN started adopting this notion of conflict resolution, it was a hybrid approach, taking both from the classical tradition and the conflict resolution tradition. And so you saw offices of the Ombudsman pop up in the late 80s, early 90s. Our office, the UN Ombudsman and Mediation Services, was established in 2002 with the appointment of Ambassador Durant. And since that time, we've grown. And so, you know, I consider myself, notwithstanding this tradition, to be a conflict resolution professional. And so maybe I can share with the group a little bit about how I practice. And, you know, it's very strange because while I do mediation, a lot of my practice is focused on individual consultations. And what I try to do is take the spirit of mediation and apply that to my individual consultations. And so oftentimes when someone comes to me with a problem in the workplace, it usually is some sort of interpersonal dispute. And, you know, I've been practicing as an ombudsman now for 15 or 16 years. And I have to say that the cases that I'm most proud of is that 1 hour conversation that I've had with someone who was going into a very difficult conversation with a peer or a supervisor. And, you know, and by talking them through, they were able by themselves to have a conversation that, you know, addressed the needs and interests of the other person, increased the likelihood of having a mutual gains approach and a win-win solution. And so those are the things that in my practice, you know, continue this tradition of conflict resolution that we've heard from the other speakers. And so maybe with that, you know, I'll just sort of end my intervention right now, but I just wanted to say, you know, what a special evening this was for me to be able to contribute this and have a lot of different aspects of my life converge together. And I've just recently returned to Geneva. I was the regional ombudsman based in Nairobi, Kenya for 10 years. So this is also quite special. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for sharing your insights as well, and very glad that it could be useful for the UN perspective as well. We are going to begin with a few questions. Firstly, to Laura Skillen. She is the Executive Director of the International Mediation Institute, and she would also like to make some remarks and ask a question. So Laura, I'm going to unmute you now.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Look, thank you so much to all the presenters. It's been really fantastic. I mean, Jeremy, I loved your Tri-OS model. Ken, I'm deeply impressed by the library behind you. And I also found Dr. Klimecki's presentation really interesting. And I just had a couple of questions, actually. So, as you know, I'm the Executive Director of the International Mediation Institute. But sort of echoing the Ombudsman's comments about convergence, this is also bringing parts of my life together, because my other hat is actually researching blame and politics and polarization and emotions. And so I had to have a couple of questions. And so, Dr. Klimecki, I'm just trying to untangle a little bit the interplay between empathy and compassion. Because on the one hand, you described sort of empathy as this thing which is constructive or destructive, and then compassion is constructive. But then you went on to sort of describe compassion as part of empathy. And I'm just, I guess, trying to understand a little bit, because certainly in my own work, I've seen that compassion for a victim can help you sort of actually be riled up against a perceived perpetrator. So I'm just trying to understand this type of operation. And my second question, if I can be so cheeky, is because he describes people as more conservative or more right-wing people as being less sympathetic. And of course, I think, as I understand it, this relates a little bit to scale, in that, you know, right-wing people tend to be empathetic towards people they see like them, as opposed to this sort of more general understanding of empathy. And I'm wondering if like a similar thing happens with what you described as compassion fade. Because I mean, there's ways of reframing a population as an individual. For example, in my own work, people described all of the country of Greece as Greek, right? So therefore they become one whole victim. And I'm sort of wondering, well, is reframing a population as a sort of individual agent in a way I mean, does that open up possibilities for altering associated emotions and therefore resolution prospects? And that's me.
Thank you, Laura. Olga, would you like to share?
Yeah, thank you. So about the compassion, about your first part on compassion, I actually have a secret agenda for my future research, and that's to look at the limits of compassion. So when should we not train compassion, because it may be harmful to engage in too much compassion, and we may not have sufficient self-protection, be it on an individual level or at a group level, if we have too much compassion for the other side, so to speak. But that's yet, at least to my knowledge, unexplored territory in terms of conflict resolution. I think the psychotherapy world is further advanced in that field. With regard to empathy of right-wing people, I may have gone over it a bit too quickly, but there are several studies showing that actually people who have a right-wing orientation are less motivated and feel less empathy for people of an adversarial group, be it immigrants, be it left-wing people, be it migrants. So yeah, it was a bit my shortcut. And yes, I think that probably individualizing people from an out group could help. I think in the compassion approach that I've been working with now for 13 years, the idea is to expand the circle of people that we feel caring for, to include more and more people, and ideally to include everyone. And this helps through individualizations, but also through reconnecting to ourselves in a compassionate way first. But yeah, I don't know whether I answered your questions fully. And I posted something on the shame part on the talk. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Olga. Yes, we had Caroline Harper from UNHCR. She's the senior advisor on ethics, diversity, and gender equity. She was asking about shame and how this plays into conflict. So thank you all for your responses. We see the chat is very collaborative. So thank you for that. If anyone else has any questions, please ask. All you have to do is raise your hand. You have to press the participants icon, and then you'll be able to select raise your hand. We are very glad to have about 10 minutes left to answer your questions. I think we have one from Arlene Weingart. I see a tick there. So I'll unmute you in case you have a question.
I don't have a question.
Oh, you don't? No. That's okay. But thank you for the tick. We'll wait then for any hands up for questions.
And if there are no questions, in the spirit of what's been going on earlier, Natalie, I'm wondering if people would be willing to extend this call by an extra 10 minutes so that we can try and do a social experiment. And so here's the idea, and I'll ask you just to vote with a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you like this idea. We're thinking we're all online. We don't know one another. We can't speak in big groups in 20 minutes. So the idea would be to break us all up into small groups of 4 to 5 people, or maybe even 3 to 4 people. And we would leave you 15 minutes in each room. And we would ask you in each room that the youngest person, so you can quickly have one criteria, as Ken pointed out, to select the person. So the idea would be the youngest person would come back in and summarize in the chat group what you discussed. And the idea would be we'd put you in your rooms right now and ask you in 15 minutes to talk about, first of all, what are your reactions to what you've heard this evening? And any 1 or 2 ideas that come to you about what could be an improvement in the process as you see it for advancing or enhancing conflict resolution. What could be done? Any ideas? Just the idea is to throw you into a room, leave you 15 minutes amongst yourselves, and you'll come back, and not everybody will have the time to speak, but the youngest rapporteur can come in and chat and throw in these ideas, and we'll be able to share them at the end of our call. Are you all open to that idea? Kind of a thumbs up if you are. Because if there's no question, I think we should try it. It's never been done. First time at the UN we do this. This is an example of using technology to try something new.
It sounds great, Jeremy. It's for those who can stay, please do. We invite you to be part of this social experiment. For those who can't, no worries. We will definitely send the slides. But before we get to that, we do have one question from Malta. Malta, good. She's she's one of our UN colleagues. She says, a question to the mediators. What do you do when you have your own opinion on the matter being discussed by the parties? Jeremy or Ken, would you like to answer there?
Sure. Jeremy, do you want to go first?
Oh, after you, Ken, always.
Okay. So it's actually very useful for you to have your own opinion. The problem comes when your opinion turns into a judgment or when it excludes other opinions. So to have an opinion is a useful thing. It just means you're alive. But to be stuck in that opinion makes it difficult for you to play the role as a mediator. In the book that Jeremy mentioned, Mediating Dangerously, I wrote about an idea, which is a shift away from the concept of neutrality, which means no opinions, to the concept of what I call omnipartiality, which means being on everybody's side at the same time. So actually making a transition to realizing that somebody else's opinion that differs from yours is a gift, is a gigantic shift. And it's not one that is very easy to make in politics because the assumption is that there is a single correct way forward and that single correct way forward is mine and not yours. There's a whole field of study that is called swarm intelligence. And if I were to take a very large bowl and set it out in front of everyone here, and that bowl were filled with marbles or beans or any number of other little objects, and I were to ask this group of people, how many marbles or beans are there in this bowl? Generally speaking, the closest to correct answer will be the average of all of our estimates put together. And this is a kind of swarm intelligence, a kind of intelligence that says that the whole can in fact be greater than the sum of its parts, that your idea can make my idea better. And in South Africa, there's an idea called Ubuntu, which expresses this, which says that I am who I am because you are who you are. And together, we are each able to become larger than we were before because of our relationship. And I think we have the sense of this. We have grown as a result of our interactions with other people. So instead of suppressing the idea that you have, instead open it up to improvement by interaction with someone who has a different idea. There's a professor at Oxford whose name is Isaiah Berlin, who wrote a number of very interesting pieces about a whole series of different subjects, literary interpretation, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the pieces that he wrote was about politics. And what he said was that politics is inherently unscientific. He described it as unphilosophical. But what he meant by that is without a single correct provable answer. And if that is the case, then we are drawn to pluralism of some form or other, to dialogue, to interaction, simply as a way of figuring out what the best solution is. So in my view, having an opinion is a useful entry point, as long as we know that we are not the only ones with opinions, as long as we're interested in other opinions, as long as we realize that the combination of those opinions together will get us to some better opinion than we started with when we began. Hopefully that is helpful. There's another approach which I want to mention, which is when you have a judgment about the other person that you are with. Here's what I do as a mediator when that judgment pops up. The opinion not just about politics, but about who the other person is. The question I ask myself is, what would have had to have happened to me to make me act like that? And that isn't an answer. It's the platform for a question that I can then pose to the other person to find out what happened to them. I'll go back to what Jeremy said earlier about the man who in the mediation session was upset and he could hear the child crying in the back of the room. All that is simply a degree of freedom in the conversation that allows you to take that emotional upset over being locked up for weeks with screaming children and drag it 90 degrees in a brand new direction just by asking the person what it felt like, what was happening in his life. And that orientation to inquiry, to curiosity, to learning is itself a part of the solution.
I would also just add one other thing. It's clearly about just self-awareness. You know you have the opinion, be aware of it, and then remember your role. Are you here as the mediator or the conciliator? If that's what if you are hard to conciliate, maybe they want to hear your opinion, but you have to be very careful in how you formulate it and present it, not to create that escalation of your siding, you're partial with one side or the other. But honestly, if you're there as the mediator, just bite your tongue. I know it's so difficult. There'll be emotional seepage, nonverbal seepage. We might give with our body language some indication of what we really think, but it's, I think, the role of the mediator not to be providing their personal opinions and to facilitate the dialogue between the people involved in the discussion. Not always easy, especially if you've been trained as a lawyer for many decades before you get to mediation, for example, as is the case for me. Do we have any more questions, Natalie?
We do indeed. We have a few minutes left, so
Okay.
Let's get to 2 questions, if you don't mind. We have Cécile Maître-Ferry. I'm just going to unmute you now.
Yes, thank you. I had a quick question. Just, you said that empathy and compassion could be promoted by people, by giving instructions. So I would like to know if you had any examples of how you could do that out of, how to say, a testing lab in a more day-to-day basis. Thank you.
Yeah, so the way we did it is maybe a bit uncommon in UN circles. We did it through meditation. And the meditation I was basing a lot of my research on, and still do, is called loving kindness meditation. So basically it follows a set of persons you visualize. You have a set of sentences that you can say, but the most important is the experiential part. I will walk you through this briefly. So the idea is to grow feelings of benevolence and of kindness towards oneself and towards others. Traditionally, in Western countries, we start with a benefactor, so with a person who has done us a lot of good. It can be a teacher, a parent, a grandparent, whoever. And we visualize this person as if it was in front of us or beside us, and we visualize one of 2 things. So either we visualize how we send them wishes of may you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be safe, and we not only use these sentences and the visualization, but we also reconnect to how does it feel like in our bodies, how does it feel around the heart area, but also in the rest of our bodies, to the really experiential part of it. And another way of starting it is that the benefactor, we imagine how the benefactor actually sends us these wishes. So I would imagine my grandmother saying to me, Olga, may you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be safe. And this is a point of entry which may make it easier for people who find it difficult to relate to that kind of practice. Then the next target person is ourselves. So we say to ourselves, may I be happy, may I be safe, etc. And we really get into that feeling of how does it feel like and how does it change. And we move to a neutral person. We move to a difficult person, so the difficult person of the moment. And I can tell you one secret, all my previous difficult persons have ceased to be difficult persons after I applied this mediation to them. Some after just one meditation of 5 minutes. Others, it took me weeks or months. but I got rid of all of my difficult persons in that way so far. And then the final category is applied to all beings. So may all beings in this room, in this country, on this planet be safe, be happy, be healthy, etc. And this kind of practice can be done on any scale, ranging from 5 minutes to 6 years, right? It can be done just for one person. And I think now the most important is really to work with ourselves, to improve this attitude of caring and compassion with ourselves. And then the rest of it naturally flourishes. But this is how we did it.
Just as an addition to what Olga is saying, one way of thinking of it is you can elicit empathy through storytelling. So if you just ask someone what happened, you will begin to experience empathy with the storyteller as you construct inside yourself the story that they are telling as though it had happened to you. And compassion, you can elicit by asking, how did that feel? Compassion is really, in my view, more like suffering with someone. There is also a Tibetan meditation practice called Tonglen, in which you breathe out all of the well-being and health that you possess, and you breathe in all of the suffering and misery that exists in others. It's counterintuitive, but it releases a kind of trigger of defensiveness that permits the compassion to grow quite substantially. There's also a distinction, I think, between sympathy and empathy and compassion. And sympathy is more like, poor you, I feel sorry for you, but it's an externalization of what has happened to someone. And it's the internal piece of it is actually ambiguous. But internally, what happens with empathy is they have discovered by doing some neurophysiological work that people with high degrees of empathy will actually finish the story before the storyteller does, get to the place of conclusion. In mediation, compassion is difficult because if someone is sobbing uncontrollably and you begin sobbing in a session where the other person is there, you will have just lost the other person. So I think of empathy as our strongest and most important ally in this work. But the capacity for compassion is very important. And people in conflict routinely dismantle their capacity for empathy and compassion.
May I also do one more addition?
Yeah.
This is actually something I've remarked on it in a different teaching, and it's something that helped me to relate to the practice when I got stuck. So there were times in my life when I couldn't do any kind of loving kindness practice. It just wouldn't work. And my meditation teachers at that time told me that I first have to connect to my own suffering. I was in a state of very strong suffering at the time. This was 12 years ago. And they said, first you have to really reconnect and feel a kind of compassion for your own suffering. So use sentences like, may I hold my suffering with compassion, or sentences like that. And once I did that practice, the rest of it opened up. So it also depends on using this kind of practice skillfully and seeing where people are and how to use it. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Thank you very much for those insights. Really appreciate it. I know we're running a little bit over time now, so if you have to go, thank you very much for joining us. As we said, we will make sure we share all the resources with you. There is one more question though, and I don't want to forget Sharon McCallerum. I will unmute you now, and this will be just our final question for tonight.
Oh, sorry. No, I had my hand up was for the breakout rooms.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry, but we won't be able to get to the breakout rooms today, but only because we're simply out of time. But maybe out of popular demand, we might have to have another session on a related topic.
I was going to suggest two things then for us to close tonight. First of all, Natalie, thank you for all the organizational efforts you put into this. Ken, Olga, It's been great. On behalf of certainly the Swiss Chamber of Commercial Mediation and the International Mediation Institute, we're very grateful and honored to have been able to be associated with the UN on tonight's event. But let's not stop here. I think a lot of people had different ideas. There's still almost 100 people with us now on the call. So let's invite you to do two things. I sent out a chat with email information for myself. Natalie, if you want to give yours as well. Send us your thoughts, first of all, about anything tonight that we could share, and maybe we can put together some reactions to what people had. And Natalie, if you're interested in doing this in the future, I'll put kind of the pressure on Ken and Olga already, but maybe in a couple of months when this coronavirus madness is over, we can meet physically or virtually again. And let's try these conversations. Let's try that social experiment, if that works for everybody. So with that, thank you very much to all of you. Natalie, I turn it over to you for the last words or whatever you want to add, and thank you again.
Thank you so much. I would firstly like to thank you all, Jeremy, Ken, and Olga, for being part of this and for the diverse discussion. And then also thank you to everyone who joined us. We've had people from around the world. It's been amazing to have you here and to be able to chat together from different perspectives, especially some mediators, some who are not mediating at all and have different roles in society. It's been great to have this more constructive event together. So we really appreciate your presence. We will send you all of the resources as soon as we can tomorrow, the video and also the slides. And if you would like more sessions like this, we would love to have them. So please email us. Jeremy has sent his email address in the chat. For the Commons, it will be commons@un.org. I also put it in the chat. Please send us your feedback and your ideas because we would love to continue the conversation. It's a very important one and we're really, really grateful that you could all be a part of this today. That's all. We wish you a really great rest of the week. Take very good care wherever you are around the world and hope to see you soon.